You know what? If people don't evolve their thinking, they're not very open-minded.
In the face of new information.
Absolutely.
Hi, I'm Deirdre Tomlinson, one of the hosts of Healing Together. On today's episode, I'm talking with Palmer Kippola, the author of Beat Autoimmune, who was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at age 19 and told to prepare for her life in a wheelchair. Today, though, Palmer lives without any active MS in her body. Our conversation covers her journey from lying on her parents' couch with a brand new MS diagnosis to running her own functional medicine coaching practice today. We talk about the root causes of autoimmune conditions, the acronym she developed to help people remember those possible causes, and why now is the perfect time to beat an autoimmune disease. I enjoyed this conversation with Palmer Kippola immensely, and I hope you do too. Let's start off by talking about total body burden. You mention that phrase in your book, and I think it'll be a nice way for us to frame the conversation regarding autoimmune diseases and their root causes and why they are getting to be very widely talked about. If you can define total body burden for us and just describe what it is, I think that will be a helpful framework.
Sure. And I love that you started off with this concept because this really is the core of the matter here. This concept of total body burden. It's really all of the toxins, toxicants, which are external toxins that we carry, that we get from the outside and we carry within us, and the chemicals. And it's not just those physical chemicals and toxicants and toxins. It's also emotional. I mean, the body doesn't really distinguish between whether it's a chemical, emotional, mental, physical stress. It's just a stress to the body. So I like to view the concept of total body burden actually as a toxin bucket, if you will. So you can visualize what a bucket looks like. And each of us has within us this bucket. Some are larger than others. And it allows us to hold a certain number of these toxins and toxicants. But what happens when we have more coming in than we're able to excrete? If you can envision a couple of holes out the bottom of the bucket, that would be our systems of elimination, right? When our elimination organs can't keep up with what's coming in, the center doesn't hold. I mean, that's when kind of the whole system goes tilt, and we have this concept, which is actually real, called leaky gut, which is scientifically known as intestinal hyperpermeability. Our guts become too leaky, and that is the gateway to autoimmune problems. So this concept of the toxin bucket then is the root of all autoimmune conditions. We're holding more toxins. In fact, they're overflowing. Our systems can't hold them all within, and our symptoms start to manifest as a result of that overflowing bucket. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I'm curious how long we've known about this. I mean, not individually, because we each are sort of learning at our own pace, but is this something that we've known about medically for 5 years, 10 years, 30, 100? Where is it in our learning?
So I can't speak to the medical perspective because I'm not a medical professional. I'm a wellness professional, which is a distinction. So we can discuss what's the difference between functional medicine and conventional medicine, because I think that's going to be a helpful distinction too. I think one book that really shone a light on this concept of toxins and toxicants being the primary driver of the autoimmune epidemic is a book by the same name, The Autoimmune Epidemic by Donna Jackson Nakazawa, who herself overcame autoimmune conditions. She's a science reporter, so she did a fantastic job, and this was in 2009. So I think it's important to understand that the people who are making the connections between toxicants, toxins, infections, we'll get to the other drivers of autoimmune conditions, are not medical professionals. This is not your doctor, your neurologist, your, any specialist that you're going to. This is people who are really seeking the truth of why these conditions are happening and why are they happening at an epidemic rate. Because if you look back 50 years ago, really didn't hear about people having autoimmune conditions. When I was diagnosed with MS in 1984, we had never heard of this.
Mm-hmm.
But you fast forward to today, and not only have we heard about them, chances are you or someone in your family or your neighbors have heard of it or is affected by this. They say that maybe 80 million Americans, and I think your question sort of implies this, have a diagnosis or no diagnosis at all, but they have these mysterious symptoms, which means they're on an autoimmune spectrum. So this has become an epidemic. One might even say a pandemic. And I think it was the book, The Autoimmune Epidemic, that really put it on the map. And I think that came out in 2009.
Okay, that's helpful to understand. And it sounds like you're describing a world in which a lot of the leadership and research is being done by people who have experienced autoimmune conditions themselves, that there's sort of like a leadership from within and from a place of experience. Was that your experience when you went through your healing journey in terms of, did you feel empowered to figure out what was going on, or was it a different experience?
So I'm giggling because in 1984 there was no internet. There was nobody who was like, the way shower to help me to figure out what to do. So to just back up a minute, you said it sounds like this is coming from within, and I have to say you're absolutely spot on that it is. I include the healing journeys of about 12 practitioners, medical doctors, functional medicine doctors in my book, because each one of them had to find their own way back or out of the problem. And many of these people were medical doctors who had never been trained in root cause medicine. They simply were providing the standard of care, which was you get diagnosed with something, and then you figure out which drug to match to the diagnosis. And that's the best that Western medicine can do. But each one of the people I profile in my book had actually been dealing with their own condition, and they had to figure it out for themselves. So yes, I think you're absolutely right that what could be called a root cause revolution has been pioneered by people who have had their own health journeys. We kind of have a saying about this, from pain to purpose, or from the mess to the mission, or the message, because people get just such conviction about we have to heal at the root cause after they go through their own experience. So that was absolutely the case in my own journey.
You use the term root cause revolution, which I love. I want to ask what that was like for you. What was your root cause revolution? And maybe to get us there, if we can back up and have you describe your own personal experience with that total body burden actually adding up to something.
Yeah.
To a manifestation of multiple sclerosis at age, I think, 19. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. Great question. So let's actually envision what was filling my bucket, just so that we can have a visual of what was going on with me. So let's start out with, I was adopted at age 3, but my birth mother was 14 years old. And I am quite sure that I inherited or downloaded, or whatever you want to call it, this stress from her that I absorbed as an infant. So that was foundational. I wasn't breastfed, which is a setup for not having a super healthy microbiome, bottle fed with formula. And I was adopted by a very loving family, mom and dad. But my dad had been a fighter pilot whose way was invariably the right way. And from my earliest memories, there was a lot of conflict in the family. So I would say that, the in utero stress followed by a childhood that was filled with yelling and verbal abuse and judgment. which is not to say that there wasn't also very loving moments and these were incredible people. I just want to try to paint a really clear picture and a distinction about what was in the bucket. So we have stress foundationally. Then we have a sugar addiction. So from my earliest memories, we never had cereals like super sugar smacks or anything crazy in our household, but we had Cheerios and Total and grape nuts. And I just feasted on cereal every morning for breakfast, and it wasn't sweet enough. So I poured sugar on top. And then as a result of the sugar and the grains, I developed cavities. And so I had a mouthful of mercury fillings and then candida. So you can see that things are mounting in the bucket, right?
Yeah.
And I actually didn't find out until about 3 years ago that I have chronic Lyme disease. And I don't know when I actually was bitten by a tick. But I just want to say that, everything that you can imagine, those high levels of mercury, possible chronic Lyme infection, the stress, all of that fills the toxin bucket until one day the center doesn't hold and the gut becomes too leaky. And what starts out as silent autoimmunity, which is the antibodies that are brewing silently in the background, at a certain point, they start to progress. So you can envision kind of a timeline: silent autoimmunity, expressive autoimmunity, which is you start to feel symptoms. And then if you let that go long enough, it becomes full-blown autoimmune disease. So the first expression of MS for me came at age 19 when I woke up one morning. I was home on summer break after my freshman year of college. And just a little footnote that I had been going to school in Vermont. So grew up in Southern California, went to college in Vermont. I was romping around the hills in the mountain club. So it's quite possible that I was bitten by a tick that freshman year of college. So just footnoting that, right? So that could, in fact, and that's my leading suspicion, that it was that tick bite that I must have had in my freshman year that actually set everything, that made my bucket overflow, if you will, caused the gut to become super leaky. And then that morning I woke up and the soles of my feet were all numb. And I just tried to shake it off because I was going off to be a hostess in a restaurant for lunch. And I thought that it started out just as tingling in my feet. I thought it would go away if I shook my feet, but it didn't go away. And the tingling just crept up my leg like a vine. And by the time late morning came around, the tingling reached my knees and I knew something was really wrong. So that's when I called my parents, who called the family doctor, who said, get her to the neurologist at UCLA today. And later that afternoon, we sat at the neurologist office, and it was, Deirdre, a 5 or 6 minute exam. She had me walk across the room, heel toe. She had me touch my fingers to my nose, and she pronounced, I'm 99% certain you have multiple sclerosis, MS. And if I'm right, there's nothing you can do except take medication. And we were just floored because, as I said earlier, we had never heard of MS. No one we knew had this. So it was just the biggest mystery, and there was no information, very little hope. She said, we can schedule an NMR, which stands for nuclear magnetic resonance image, which is the scary precursor name to the MRI. But aside from that, just go home and wait. And that was that. So we left her office that afternoon, and by that time, the tingling had reached my chest. And we were just freaked out. I mean, I have to tell you that getting in the car and, not knowing what life might be like, after that day, it was just a terrifying time. And just to close out that first day, by the time we got home that night, my body started going numb. So all the areas that were tingling from literally the bottom of my feet all the way up right underneath my chin on my neck had been tingling. But by the time we crawled into bed that night, every part of my body had gone numb, completely numb, like enshrouded in this complete fog. And my body would stay fully numb for 6 weeks. So that was my very first, what's called an exacerbation of MS.
It does sound terrifying. And it feels like you leave that experience with no doubt that there's something wrong.
Right.
It's like, okay, there's a problem here. This is not normal. And my understanding is that a lot of autoimmune symptoms actually come on much, much more slowly. And maybe this is the transition from the silent expression to the felt expression that you were describing earlier of autoimmunity, that for some people that transition is longer. I'm sure that you've heard stories and spoken with people for whom that transition took a lot longer. How would you contrast those? I sort of wonder if there was sort of no doubt, right? By the end of that day, you were like, okay, there's a problem. And if I want to address it, at least I know that I need to.
Right.
I can imagine it's harder for some people where it's, 6 years of a dribble of symptoms and they're not sure if there's really something wrong or if it's just not enough sleep.
You're absolutely right. It is not typical that symptoms come on like you're hit by a Mack truck. That is unusual. And in all of my research and interviews and everything that I know about autoimmunity, you can typically go back in your mind to an earlier time when you started to feel something wrong. So you're absolutely right that it is not typical to be hit by a Mack truck. On the other hand, I don't know if it was, and I've always been pretty intuitive about my body and things that are going wrong or, what's going well. In this case, there just was no prodromal period. So very clear symptoms, very clearly something was wrong. And the best we knew was the only thing that I could do was to take medication. And for whatever reason, my intuition was not a good idea. But I didn't learn until much later. My parents told me that the doctor had pulled them aside right before we left and said, you guys better get ready for her life in a wheelchair because that's where she's heading. That's everything we knew. That was it.
Wow. Well, so we can clarify for our listeners right now, you are not in a wheelchair. So spoiler alert, that is not how this story ends. But instead of necessarily going down that medication route right away, you tried a bunch of experiments over the first few years. That's my understanding.
Yes.
And I'm curious how you went about that. What experiments did you try and what convinced you to try those?
Thank you for guiding me back there because so you have to picture this scene. Like I'm lying on the couch that summer
Yep.
for 6 weeks, right? I'm 19 years old. We don't have any idea what just happened.
Yeah.
Life seems very bleak. We wonder if I'm going to be able to go to college again, maybe in a wheelchair. Would I have to live at home with my parents? I mean, this is understandably distressful for anyone. Certainly somebody who's numb from the neck down. Like, am I going to need to be taken care of? But during this time, also, we had friends that weren't too scared off by this mysterious disease that came to visit. And some brought the usual cookies or books or watched movies with me. And this one family friend came over and she brought what I didn't realize was a gift until years later. But this is really pivotal to this whole experiment discussion. She said, Palmer, why do you think you got the MS? What do you mean? Why do I think I got the MS? Like, are you insinuating that I brought this on? Do you think? I wonder. Deirdre, I had nowhere to go that summer. So I just lay there, right? And in a flash of insight, so imagine I'm 19 years old. I'm just chewing on that question like a dog with a bone. And it came to me that as that baby, as I mentioned to you, who was adopted by these parents, my dad was super judgmental and he liked things a certain way and he yelled a lot. And in that moment, I had this flash of insight that earliest memory that I had, I was about age 3 or 4. And my dad is yelling at my mom, who's locked herself in her room and she's undoubtedly crying. And I am standing in the hallway facing my dad with my little dukes up, shouting back to him, if you don't stop yelling at mom, I'll sock your lights out, or whatever a 3 or 4-year-old might say to her dad. I had become this child warrior. I wasn't taking anything from anybody, but in that process, I had become hypervigilant. I was always scanning the environment for safety. So I'm lying on the couch at 19, and I envisioned that my immune system somehow must have become hypervigilant too, that if it didn't have its own real battle to wage, like viruses, parasites, whatever. And I didn't know anything about the immune system. So this was just, who knows, divine intervention. I imagined that my immune system had turned against my own body. And that is, in fact, the autoimmune attack, which we can get into when, I understood more about that. But that insight that chronic stress was the root of the MS still rings true for me today, even though I definitely know there's more to the story. We've already talked about what was filling my toxin bucket. But at the time, when I figured out, oh my God, it's the stress. My body just couldn't handle it anymore. And that's why this happened. And so you also have to understand that my dad, in addition to being kind of the perpetrator, if you will, we all have roles to play in families. He was also extremely motivational and extremely loving in his own way. And almost the moment we got home from the neurologist's office, he would say, honey, you're going to beat this thing. I know you are. You can do it. So you see what I'm saying? This crazy, like, this happened as a result of the stress, and yet he's telling me you can beat this. And I had no idea how that was going to happen, but that was the impetus. Like, on the one hand, I had the doctor saying all you can do is take medication, listening in one ear. And on the other side, I had my dad saying, honey, you can beat this thing. So that was the genesis of why I decided to start doing these experiments. And of course, the first thing that I decided to try was stress reduction, because if I'm always on and completely stressed out and, hypervigilant, awake in the middle of the night kind of thing, then I needed to figure out how to calm down. So I started doing yoga in the late 80s, actually the mid 80s. I started meditating in the early 90s. And Deirdre, I noticed that when I was relaxed, when I actually chilled, I had fewer MS symptoms. And conversely, when I was stressed out, I eventually went back to school. So we have to put a bow on that. The numbness and tingling retreated in the nick of time for me to go back to school. But it would take a full 2 years for the numbness to go away completely. And it turns out that I did have relapsing remitting MS, meaning symptoms come and go. But I did notice almost immediately that when I was stressed out, I would have a worsening of symptoms, or new symptoms would flare up. And conversely, when I was relaxed, like I did my deep breathing and meditation and yoga, I was calmer and I had fewer symptoms. So that was a fantastic, and that was my biggest, and for many, many years, 20 years, that was my best experiment.
What happened after 20 years that changed that statement?
All right. So I also tried a number of other things in the interim, because let me just touch on, if you don't mind, briefly.
Of course.
All we had available to us was the library at the time. So Santa Monica Library, here I come, looking for anything that I could get my hands on for MS. And I figured that diet must have something to do with this. So I found the Swank MS diet book, which purported that a low-fat vegetarian diet was the best diet, in fact, for MS. So I had been an omnivore, and I took out all meat, and we were already a low-fat family, but we went to completely non-fat milk ice cream, ridiculously low-fat. And not only did I not notice an improvement of MS symptoms, I noticed a worsening of tummy trouble after eating, which I thought was normal. I think many people probably believe that whatever's going on with them, they just get used to because we adapt.
Yep.
Right? So that rumbling that you feel after eating, oh, it's just normal. But with the advent of more, I'm using air quotes, which you can't see, but healthy whole grains, I started having more tummy trouble, and my MS symptoms still worsened. So that was not helpful. The only thing that really worked over those 20 plus years was the stress reduction techniques. And I tried medication for a period of time because a doctor threatened that if I didn't try medication, not only would I wind up in a wheelchair, but my life would be shortened because, just because.
Yeah.
So that did not help. So those were the three biggies. And then it was in 2010 that I finally wised up and started learning enough about nutrition. Now, keep in mind, I was in the high-tech industry. I was in sales and marketing for technology companies. I was not in a health field. So this is just me trying things on my own without any guidance or anything, really. But by 2010, I think the world started to wake up to nutrition, or at least I did. And I found a functional medicine nutritionist. And I think it's an important time to just mention that functional medicine is a real science-based, systems-based medicine that does not look at you as a collection of body parts, but as an integrated whole, mind, body, spirit. And it's focused on why you have a particular condition. And that question that our family friend asked me of why I got the MS, no one had asked me that question until I found this functional medicine nutritionist who was helping me answer the question why I got it in the first place. So back to that concept of the root cause revolution, we now have this growing community of functional medicine doctors. It's all about restoring function. So it's kind of a weird name, but the idea is based in optimizing your health to be the best human you can be by working at the root cause level. So this particular nutritionist ran some tests, and we found out that I have what's called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. In other words, I don't have celiac disease, but I'm very sensitive to this inflammatory protein called gluten, which is found in all grains, different types of gluten. I'm not an expert in this, but I do know that there are varying degrees of types of gluten, the one in wheat, rye, barley being the most inflammatory. It's just this incredibly difficult to digest protein that for those of us with an autoimmune proclivity becomes really our nemesis because it's inflaming our guts, our small intestines to be specific. And actually, gluten, we found out in 2015, creates a leaky gut in anyone who eats it. So for people who have an autoimmune condition or think they might, or it runs in your family, just heads up. Now we have a choice as to whether or not we want to continue eating this because now we know that a leaky gut is the pathway to autoimmunity. But I may be jumping ahead of myself here.
No, that's great. And I love that call out too. It's the way you phrased that. It feels like a choice and not a sentence. It's like, hey, we just happen to have learned this thing.
Yes.
This is what we know in terms of the latest interaction between this protein and our bodies. And if you are prone to an autoimmune disease, or if you have enough stuff going on in your life that your bucket is pretty full, this might be something you want to think about or make a choice about.
That is so beautifully said. I couldn't say it more beautifully myself. It really is. It does become a choice. Once you know enough, then you're empowered to make different decisions. If you don't know something, you're not empowered. It doesn't mean that you couldn't be empowered. It just means you don't have the information yet. So the question is, is this information widely disseminated? Not yet. So let's get back to my healing, and then we can talk about what we now know. Would that be okay?
Yeah, perfect.
All right. So this functional medicine nutritionist educated me on the perils of eating gluten and what it was doing to my own gut. And she didn't link it to the MS. That wasn't, we didn't take it that far. All she was saying is, look, this is what's causing your tummy troubles, but it's creating a leaky gut and that's bad. So she led me through an elimination diet, which is known as the quote, gold standard of figuring out your food sensitivities. These are not true allergies like you eat a peanut and you go into anaphylactic shock. This is you eat a food and you have this delayed food sensitivity where it's really a conundrum to figure it out because you eat the gluten, for example, like I was eating it 3 meals a day, cereal, sandwiches, pasta, pizza, and not knowing that it was creating problems. So that's what's so insidious. It's the insidious nature of these hidden food sensitivities that we don't see immediate cause and effect. So we continue doing things not knowing that we're harming ourselves. So I took gluten out, dairy, all of the usual suspects, eggs, soy, corn for a month. Within a week, I stopped having digestive distress after eating. I mean, no more rumbling tummy, no nothing. And then within a month of removing the gluten in particular, I stopped having any and all MS symptoms ever again. And this was November of 2010.
Wow.
And to this day, I have not had a tingling baby toe, not a single MS symptom in my life, in my world, in my experience. And I want to put a point on this so that people understand, what I was going through at the time. So it's November of 2010, no MS symptoms anymore. My husband and I are looking at each other like, what in the world just happened? This is almost impossible to believe.
Yeah.
Right? So what did I do? I made an appointment with my neurologist to share the happy news.
Yeah.
Because I thought, I just can't even believe this. He had said I needed medication, but what was this, right? I walk into his office and he says, Palmer, gluten sensitivity is a fad, and I want you to go back on the medication. And that was that. So, I can tell you that it's been 10 years now, but a couple years ago, I decided to go back to see him because I wondered, like you often wonder, how has thinking evolved, right? So I haven't had a single MS symptom, but I thought, probably a good idea for me to get a follow-up MRI because that's the way we figure out, is MS progressing? Is it in a holding pattern? What's happening? So I walk in his office this time, and he was definitely surprised to see me. And this time he had his tail kind of between his legs, and he said, Palmer, we now know that gluten sensitivity is real, and I bet about a third of my patients are sensitive to gluten. And yeah, it's probably a good idea for you to get another MRI. So it was a little bit of feeling vindicated, but that's a 10-year gap where first it felt condescended to and almost ridiculed that something so simple could have such a powerful result, to him now understanding that this is real and he's read the literature. I mean, the science is there for anyone who wants to see it. I'm not sitting here in my office making stuff up. So that was my experience, but I want to be really clear right up front that my experience does not look like other people's necessarily, and we'll get into the other root causes that people need to explore. I am not suggesting that, all you have to do is remove gluten and you're done. So we'll talk about that, but just to wrap this story up, I went and I had that follow-up MRI, and I came back to his office the next week, and he was smiling, which is rare. And he had me sit next to him. And he put up the before MRIs and the after, which were kind of hard to distinguish because, the technology has gotten so good. You can see so much more now. And he said, Palmer, there's no new lesions. And the ones that used to be there have either disappeared or are fading. And he looked at me and he said, this couldn't be a better story. And I said, are you even sure it was MS? And he showed me the pattern called Dawson's finger, which is a pattern of how lesions are scattered around a particular part of the brain that are consistent with MS. So I was always wondering, is this really MS? And he said, you know what, your MS must have been benign after all. And I want to be clear in my research and discussing this with many, many scientists and doctors that there is no such thing as benign MS.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
Different degrees of severity and so forth. But it turns out that, as we were talking about, the optional continuing to eat gluten, for example, when we discover what these root causes of these autoimmune conditions are, it really becomes optional to continue suffering. and to continue going down the path of more autoimmune expression and then full-blown tissue damage. But now we know way more than we did. And so that's the stand that I'm taking, is to help people wake up to the information and then empower themselves if they choose to do that.
Healing Together is sponsored by Healthenly. Healthenly brings together patients and caregivers who want to connect with people who've been there before.
Healthenly is a place to get mentorship from someone who's been through what you're going through. It's not a doctor's visit, but it's so much more than a social media group, which, let's face it, sometimes don't provide the meaningful hand-holding we want.
And social media can also feel like a place where you don't want to share what's really going on, because you never know what's going to come back at you. On Healthenly, you can find someone like you, we call them health angels, to provide advice and support and be your sounding board during a health challenge.
Like one health angel, Stacy, who joined Healthenly to guide and support other diabetics. She talks about how great it feels to use her own experience as a diabetic to help other people who are struggling.
When you think about it, it's amazing how many of us have real health knowledge that can make a difference for others. And I know when I'm dealing with a health issue, I just want to find someone who's been through the same thing.
Check it out. It's all free. Healthenly.org. One of the things, in addition to the learning that we've been doing about autoimmune diseases and leaky gut and gluten, is our ability to influence the expression of our genes. And I think that may be one of the things that you're getting at there in terms of, benign MS is maybe not the way to put it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're saying I had MS, but I had the option to influence the way that my genes expressed and produced that expression in my body.
Yes. So for anyone listening to this, I am clear that I will always have the genes for MS. That's the blueprint for our bodies. But I can control mostly, not everything, right? We think we're in control, but often we're not. But there is much that I can control as to whether or not those genes get expressed again. I simply know too much now. And I'm not sitting here saying, oh, it's in remission, which sounds to me like something is lurking and just ready to pounce back. I'm saying that I don't have the expression of MS in my body anymore. And that's clear on lab tests and on the MRI. And there's a lab now called Cyrex Laboratories that's focused on autoimmune prevention, really, because they look at antibodies that you might develop to your own tissues. And you can tell whether or not you're brewing these antibodies even when it's silent. And so I've subsequently had tests that show that all of my antibodies to my myelin basic protein and other neurological tissues are in the completely normal range, which is an indication that the lab work, the blood work shows there's no expression of MS in my body. The MRI shows evidence that it used to be there, but it's not flaring, it's not present or currently being expressed. So that's how I would describe it.
Congratulations on that. It's amazing, and it just must feel really good to feel like you influenced that and you had some control over that.
Well, let me just say thank you for the congratulations, although it feels like I didn't know at the time what I was doing, and we can talk about what I did do, backing into that. But I want to be clear that anybody can do this. I don't have any superpowers.
Yeah.
And I think it's available to anyone who is seeking healing, who is willing to explore and experiment with addressing these root causes head on. It's not available just because of divine intervention. I mean, miracles I'm sure happen, and spontaneous remissions happen in cancer and so forth. But this really does take work. And that's where I just had this cognitive dissonance after I healed, Deirdre. I couldn't fathom, how is it that this average woman like me who was just working in technology, who had been told by 6 neurologists over 26 years that there was nothing I could do except take medication. And here I was, free of symptoms, free of lesions. There were signs that this is what it was, but there's nothing active in my body. How is it that I could have experienced this reversal of the expression of MS? And that's the path that I set out on. And that's when I quit my day job because I just couldn't. I was almost feeling dizzy because I couldn't understand how it was possible. So I needed to dig into the research. That's just what I do. So that's what I did.
Yeah. And I would love to get into, you have an amazing acronym to help people think through the possible other causes or root causes that could be filling up someone's bucket and driving them towards the expression or the experience of an autoimmune disease. But maybe as a caveat, before we talk about that acronym, how do you feel or what do you say to people who get, their eyes glaze over or they get upset because in this conversation, it sounds like, the extension of what we're saying, we haven't said it, but the extension might be that we're actually blaming the patient for not curing themselves. And some people can't, or they don't. And maybe there's not that much difference between can't and don't, and so that doesn't matter. But I guess I wonder about the possibility that people may feel like there's some blame underneath that, which I don't think is your intention, but I wanted to ask about that. How much of a role do we have personally?
It's such a good question, and I'm glad you asked it because it wasn't in my realm of consciousness that I am presenting this in some way to blame people. That it isn't even in my it's not even in my brain or my thinking that I would hold that. But by implication, it's very clear that we are far more in control of our health outcomes than we ever imagined possible. So I think the paradigm that we're talking about here is a sea change because forever, maybe all of last century, we thought that doctors knew everything. We just put our faith and our trust that if you're sick, you go to a doctor and you get better. End of story. But when you get these mysterious gray area symptoms of autoimmunity, you don't really go to the same doctor and get answers and get better. So this is also important kind of as a distinction. And I don't want to get into fault and blame about doctors because that's also not my purview. One could say, now that my neurologist knew that gluten sensitivity is real, is he educating his patients about gluten? The answer is no. So when does it become egregious that doctors are not educating their patients when they know enough? But we can get sidetracked. So I want to go back to the question. We now know enough to know that full healing, full control of the expression of disease is possible. I call these autoimmune conditions because they are conditional based on how you live. The fact that you don't know that is not your fault, but once you do know that, you have an opportunity to influence your health outcomes. Does that make sense? It's kind of like we live in one paradigm until we wake up to, gee, that's not even the right place to go for help. And I tell some clients, I have a male client I just told this to yesterday, when you want a haircut, you don't go to Home Depot, you go to the barber. When you have brain fog, profound fatigue, aches and pains, numbness and tingling, any of these autoimmune symptoms, we want answers, we want help, but people continue to try to use their insurance-based primary care providers, get as much as they can out of the system. But these poor doctors don't even know what to do with you because that's not what they're trained to do. So Western medicine is perfectly well equipped to deal with emergencies, acute situations like surgery, broken bones, heart attack. You're having a heart attack, you want to go to a Western hospital. But if you're not able to sleep, if you've got these aches and pains, migrating joint pain, brain fog, blah, 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 that's not the purview of Western medicine. And this is where functional medicine or naturopathy comes in, because those systems of medicine, which is, one could look to ancient medicines like traditional Chinese medicine that's been practicing root cause medicine maybe for years and years. There's a different system that is addressing root causes. So it's a really important distinction. I hope that's helpful.
No, it is. And maybe not every physician in today's world would agree with that, but I interviewed a physician a month ago who said something very similar, that the Western medicine culture is very well equipped and equips doctors to treat acute situations. But when it comes to chronic symptoms or chronic illness, it's just not what that system is designed for. So I think at least some physicians would agree with your assessment there.
But I also want to be clear that there are doctors. I think there is an expansion of open-mindedness to consider there is more to the story than what I learned in medical school. Yeah. And they are actually embracing more of an open mind. And at least as, there are many people who have these mysterious symptoms who now have access to the internet. So people are empowering themselves. And when they feel bad, they are doing their best to self-diagnose, and they're coming to their doctors prepared with questions. And look, there might be a diet that I could try for this. And it's fantastic. I mean, this is one of the benefits, supreme benefits of the internet, is this expansion of information. And yes, there is a lot of confusing information out there, but we now have way more information at our fingertips than we ever, certainly than 1984, when all I had was the public library and my intuition. So yes, I'm not blaming anybody for the situation they're in. I would frame it as an opportunity to dig deeper and ask the question, why do you think you got blank? Why do you think you got blank? And it might look very different than why I got the MS.
That's a really beautiful invitation just to everyone. Why, to ask that question of yourself, why do you think you got blank? And that leads us into talking a little more about this acronym that you created and that you use to keep track of the potential root causes that might be, in someone's life that are leading to their symptoms.
Yes.
Do you want to cover those briefly? I think it would just be helpful for people to understand that it's a pretty wide gamut of possible root causes.
It is, but this is where empowerment comes from. So I absolutely do. And this is something that once I had quit my job and I found this super empowering science of epigenetics, which shows us that our genes are not our destiny. It's not our DNA. It's the expression of our genes that's based on the environment. And then I was really interested in learning, well, what are those inflammatory environmental factors that are triggering or turning these genes on? And that's what led me down this path to do more research. And I just wrote things down, Deirdre. I just wrote everything down. I had my little root cause reversal checklist. I became certified as a functional medicine health coach, and I started working with people. And I saw time and time again, when they started addressing inflammatory foods and getting them out of their diet, when they started healing their guts, when they started dealing with infections, finding out that they had something going on, whether it was a Lyme infection or candida or parasites maybe, and they addressed them, these people healed. So I thought, it's time to write a book. And this just had to come out of me. It wasn't even optional at this point. It was, I'm on a mission, full on mission. But I needed to come up with a word that people could remember so that they knew all of those root causes that they had to address. And so I put the words on paper and started shuffling them around. And the word that emerged was fights. And fights stands for food, infections, gut health, hormone balance, toxins, and stress. And it turns out those are all of the categories that we can control, mostly. And it's the root cause. It's how we get into the problem. But when you flip it, it's also how you heal. So instead of the inflammatory foods, we eat foods that are more optimized for us. Instead of poor gut health, we work on good gut health, and we start balancing everything by taking out the bad stuff, putting in the good stuff, healing and sealing the lining of our gut. And there is an autoimmune equation that Dr. Alessio Fasano, who's now at Harvard Medical School, discovered. I think it was in the early 2000s. He discovered this equation that your genes, which are foundational for the development of disease, right, runs in the family, that's true. But then there were these environmental factors, those fights factors that I came up with that acronym, but they didn't understand what set those two off, like what ignited autoimmunity. And it turns out it's that intestinal hyperpermeability or that leaky gut. And so what's so exciting about having this equation is if you flip it, you can potentially reverse the disease. And he writes that in the abstract of his research, which is to heal, you detect the triggers, you remove them, and you heal the lining of your gut, and you can potentially reverse the autoimmune condition. So that is the hope and the promise of working at this root cause level. So that's what FIGHTS stands for. And I can certainly run through, give an example of each one if that's helpful.
I guess what I would direct people to do actually is to get your book and to read about each of those. You devote, I think, at least a chapter or more to each of those categories.
I do. I go into great detail, and I'm honored that Mark Hyman, who is a medical doctor and one of the pioneers of the functional medicine movement, wrote the foreword for the book. So this is, again, not me sitting in my office making stuff up. This is me just trying to take the best of what's available from science, organize it in such a way that it makes it easy for people, or let's say simple, because simple does not always mean easy, but yes, to present it in a way that makes it doable, actionable for people.
Yeah, and it really does feel actionable, and it's addressable the way that you approach it.
Well, thank you for saying that, because I wrote it with 3 different audiences in mind. I wrote it for the person who is recently diagnosed, who is completely overwhelmed and doesn't know what to do or where to begin. And because I'm now a health coach, a functional medicine health coach, I take the role as walking through the journey with the reader in mind. And then I also wanted to write it for the people who have been trying for decades to heal from autoimmune conditions and just hadn't figured out all the puzzle pieces. And then there's the eager intermediate who has part of the puzzle pieces figured out, but not everything. So I really tried to write it in an empathetic and kind of a coach tone, if you will.
Well, that definitely comes across. So kudos to you on that. I want to ask, you have said there's never been a better time to beat autoimmune. And I want to ask you a little more about what that means. And maybe we should just clarify sort of the time that we're in right now. It's August 2020. We're in the middle of a pandemic. There are wildfires raging near your home, personally, for you. There's crazy weather. There's a lot happening in our society right now. And I don't know that when you say there's never been a better time to beat autoimmune, that it's necessarily in that context, but that's where we are. And I was wondering, where does that statement come from? What does that mean?
Well, thank you for asking that. It means that we have this invitation now with all of these stressors swirling around us. We can't control a lot of what happens on the outside. Our windows are sealed. We've got smoke outside. We have this pandemic. We're wearing masks. There's a lot of fear and anxiety. And all of those potential stressors serve to, I was going to say fan the flames, to use a metaphor that's very current, to really propagate autoimmunity, which we know stress is a huge root cause. But more than that, with the pandemic, and the reason I really started writing about the timing of this is that these are pre-existing conditions. These conditions make us more vulnerable to the threat of COVID. Let me explain. autoimmunity is not a body part problem. It's an immune system problem. And the reason I didn't write a book called Beat MS is that from my research, I discovered that the 150 or more autoimmune conditions that are out there and identified today can each be addressed the same way at this root cause level. But each of these conditions is also a potential pre-existing condition that makes one more vulnerable to the threat of COVID. Because we know that to fight a viral infection like COVID, we need a well-functioning immune system. People with autoimmune conditions have what I would call a disordered or a broken immune system. And why is that? Well, our immune system is located in the lining, most of it in the lining of our small intestines. And that is also the center of where autoimmunity happens or is healed, right there in the lining of the intestines. So this opportunity, when we're all indoors, when we're all under threat of these viral and other potential stressors, we have the opportunity to really take better care of our health right now to help us do better in the hopefully unlikely event that we are to catch the coronavirus. But there's a potential that if we do get COVID, that those of us with these disordered immune systems fare worse than our friends that don't have autoimmunity going on. So that's really the invitation, is the timing that we're in, that if you have a problem with your immune system, and if you have an autoimmune condition, you do. It's just the definition of autoimmunity is a disordered immune system. Then the opportunity is, well, it's time to really rejuvenate or reset your immune system. And so the same way that we beat an autoimmune condition is also how we prevent COVID or prevent a worse outcome from COVID. And that's why I talk about it being, the time is now to take care of this, not later, but right now.
That makes a lot of sense. And I hear an invitation in that too. And maybe that's where my head is this morning, but I hear a lot of invitation in what you're sharing, which is lovely. So thank you for that.
Well, I think you picked it out because that's the broader message that I really am trying to convey. I mean, this really is, and it might sound cliche to say it, but you can choose to view your illness as a gift, as an invitation to wake up to who we truly are. And that instead of blaming this or saying, why is this happening to me? Maybe to reframe it to, maybe this is happening for me. And that becomes the big invitation to get still, get quiet, and reflect on that big question. Why do you think you got the blank? And then I take you hand-holded through the book in these various chapters, and you can answer these self-assessments and determine, is your area food? Do you think you might be dealing with an infection? Because the way to healing is to address those root causes head on. That's the opportunity.
Let's see. So just to paint the picture of the person behind the voice, what do you do to stay sane and happy and fulfilled, in your personal life?
We just touched on the fires that are swirling all around us. So this is even more important. It's such a great question and even more important right now. So I think foundationally, I live a life of meaning and purpose, and I am grateful for every experience in my life. And again, I know that can sound trite, and that is who I am. It's getting aligned with who I am, and that I'm able to serve. Every day I wake up grateful that I am in this position, that I'm able to help people. So I would say that's foundational. I would add that having loving relationships is very helpful, especially during these tough times. And I have a wonderful marriage to my husband of 20 years. And I meditate every morning. I don't miss a day for 20 minutes. And I think that is a wonderful way to get grounded and really calm the nervous system, which in my case has been my biggest opportunity is to wrangle stress. And so having a practice like meditation has been really, really helpful for me. And then just I am fierce about guarding my sleep, and I get about 8 or 9 hours of sleep every night.
I'm pretty fierce about my sleep too, but I do not meditate every day. I meditate, but I'm not super consistent about doing it every day. And you're inspiring me to make that more of a daily practice. What is your favorite meal that you've been cooking or making this summer? We've talked a bit about how your diet has evolved over time. What's been fun to cook and eat and make this summer?
Oh, that is a really good question. All right. I have a couple of images coming to mind, and one is this lamb kofta, which is just this amazing ground lamb that we mix with spices, and I don't know if it's Greek or Turkish. So we make lamb kofta and dandelion greens called horta, which you boil those greens and they become super, super tender with olive oil and salt. That's really, really good. But then I'm also getting this vision of this chicken curry that my husband loves, in particular, this Indian chicken curry, this homemade. And I include some of these in the back of my book. I may include, I don't know if it's my chicken curry recipe, but there is a chicken curry recipe in my book. And finally, the last thing, because I couldn't choose, we've been making cauliflower pizza. And I didn't believe that cauliflower could stay together as a crust. But if you use eggs just a little bit, it becomes kind of a good binder. And then you can load that up with delicious vegetables, whatever pleases you. So I would say that those are the top three.
Well, that's a great list. My mouth is watering. I'm ready for lunch. For someone facing an autoimmune disease diagnosis, what else is out there that you would recommend people read, either before your book or after your book as a follow-up?
Oh, good question. So I already mentioned one book, and I want to come back to it as kind of a bookend for our discussion. It's still highly relevant today. Donna Jackson Nakazawa is the author, and she wrote The Autoimmune Epidemic. And I think this will really help people understand why this is happening now, what's going on, what we're facing in our environment with 100,000 or more chemicals. So that helps to set the stage. I highly recommend it. She also has another book that's more autobiographical that takes you through her own personal journey, which is called The Last Best Cure. And she's very open about the emotional pain that she experienced of losing her father when she was only 12, and how pretty soon after that, she started to have fainting episodes and seizures, and this whole autoimmune process began. And it wasn't until she began to address the emotional pain and add in the mind-body practices that she began to heal. So I think that is a hugely important book too.
And what are you reading right now? What's on your nightstand?
Oh my goodness. It always depends on what I'm in the mood for, because I tend to have a couple of books going at the same time. And in part, that's due to the fact that I'm in this wellness field and I interview people too. So I'm getting ready to interview Dr. Mindy Peltz, and she wrote a book called The Menopause Reset, which is an important book for women, let's say 35 and older, because that is a prime time for women to develop autoimmunity. So Dr. Mindy takes us through how to address menopause so that we can actually go through it very gracefully. That is going. And then one other work-related one, there is a book called It Didn't Start With You, Inherited Family Trauma. And that's Mark Wallin. He is an inherited family trauma specialist here in the Bay Area. And it's a fascinating topic because we know that stress is a huge driver of autoimmunity, but I don't know that many people know that the stress that they're dealing with may not even be their own. It could be inherited. And so Mark talks about the science behind inherited family trauma. He would be an interesting person for you to talk to, I think. Fascinating, fascinating book.
Thank you for that list. And thank you so much for speaking with me today. I've really enjoyed the conversation, just enjoyed understanding your journey a little more. And I hope that these fires get under control and everyone's able to go back outside again soon. Fingers crossed.
Yes, fingers and toes crossed. And Deirdre, you did a fantastic job with your questions, and it was just an honor for me to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Healing Together is produced by Healthenly. Our theme song is Ramble, composed and performed by Ed Morneau.